It's a real honor and a pleasure to introduce as our keynote for this conference Dr. John Deasy, Superintendent of the Los Angeles Unified School District, second largest school district in the nation. But that's not why we brought him here. He has been at the forefront of amazing changes in the school system, particularly on the area that we're talking about this week. He's instituted new changes in the disciplinary code in dealing with troubled youngsters in the school system, and he comes to it from a really, really interesting background. Before he joined Los Angeles School District and headed it, he served as Deputy Director of Education for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and he's been Superintendent of schools in a number of places around the country, Prince George's County, Maryland, Santa Monica, Malibu, and I could go on, but I'm not going to. And I think you'll find him really a delightful speaker. He's also been an Aspen Institute entrepreneurial leader, a Broad Fellow, and a State Superintendent of the Year. I didn't know they had those things, but and he's also, the best part of it, he started out in life, I think, as a New York City school teacher, which is really great. It's kind of welcoming him home. So please join me in welcoming Dr. John Deasy.
So thank you, everybody. I'm going to have an opportunity, hopefully, to make some comments. I want to provoke our thinking. I'm a very straight up, very direct person. So if language drifts to just street, that's who I am. And I make no apology about that, especially with the youth I get the opportunity to serve every day. I'm going to make some comments about myself, and that's the only little bit, since you're all journalists, that's off the record. This one little story I'm going to tell about myself is me, leave that alone, but it will give you context. Do what you want with the rest of it, which is totally fine. Born in Boston, grew up in Providence, moved to New York City, began teaching. Let me give you the trajectory of how that kind of happened around that. Went to college and was pre-med and was, going to head off to medical school, my beginning of my senior year at the college was in the old-fashioned, if you can imagine the old-fashioned amphitheaters with like 300 people on kind of the stone pavilion thing, and you're watching the professor way down at the bottom. And it was an OBGYN course, and they had a film, and it was of a birth on film. And I passed out cold and was horrified by the experience, completely horrified by the experience, and was like, I couldn't even see this. How could I do this? And literally went to the dean and was like, this is a disaster. And so I said, what else could I do? He says, well, you could teach biology. I was like, so tell me about that. Well, you don't need any courses, but you'd have to go through student teaching. And I said, okay. So ended up doing that, and then because it was late in the game, did my methods course, and my student teaching was involved in a juvenile prison. And then worked for a period of time as a line worker. And it had a very significant effect on the way I thought about the world and how I thought about what I wanted to do. And I came to the conclusion at that very, very unbelievably uninformed young age, that if you don't make it out of high school, they get you. At least in the cities where I grew up, in the cities where I do my work. And so the idea for me was go teach in America's high schools and change the world and that kind of stuff. And I started, and I never looked back, and I've been a very blessed guy and very lucky. So that part, that little story off the record. On the record, have chosen really to be really clear about the fact that I am not confused about the mission as a superintendent. And that mission is to lift youth out of poverty every single day. So I currently have the privilege of being the superintendent of Los Angeles Unified. So we have a pre-K program, we have a K through 12 program, we have a young adult education program. 909,000 students go to school in LA Unified every day. Give you just a tad bit of context, 87% live in circumstances of poverty, most of it unimaginable poverty. You know, our best estimates are 18,000 students are homeless. This is roofless, and I know it's LA, and weather has a contributing factor to that. They live in cars, they live in the park, they live under the 10 freeway. We have 109 languages spoken in LA Unified. We translate everything every day into 8 languages. We estimate 34% of our students and families are currently not documented, probably 40 if we pressed hard on that. We have an amazing topography. I mean, this is New York, it's vertical. We spread out if you're from LA, so we have 800 square miles. I have 1,019 campuses. We feed more kids west of the Mississippi other than the military. Every single day we feed 3 meals a day. It is an astonishing large business. It's an $8 billion annual budget. And every single one of those students wants to be you and me. They want to graduate, college, workforce ready. They want to pursue this thing called the American dream. They want an opportunity to have what you have, which is privilege, and what I have, which is privilege. And in my case, being a white man in America, most of it unearned. And so when I came and took this job, we sat and we said, we're going to do a lot of work and we're going to do it very quickly. And this is going to be a youth's right agenda. Adults have lots of rights. They're found in the Constitution, they're found in the state constitution, they're found in collective bargaining, they're found in laws all over the place. Youth have few, if any, of those. And this was going to be clear. And what we said was, if you think there's a reason that a student cannot graduate in America today, United States, or can't go to post-secondary or get a job that earns a living wage. Maybe it's that their parents don't speak English, as the overwhelming majority of my parents don't speak English. Or maybe it's because they don't have parents, or maybe both of them are in jail, or they are in jail themselves, or they live in poverty. Whatever the reason is, if you believe that that's a factor why they can't be successful, what we've said from day one is that's okay. You can have that belief. I can't hire you in LAUSD. I cannot have you in front of students. I cannot have you holding a belief that there is a reason why a student cannot be successful. How we do this work, we're all down for that. We can do that as a team. There are multiple ways to do that. I mean, I think teaching is one of the most amazing opportunities in the world. It's profoundly complex, deeply nuanced. It is rocket science for real, and not everyone can do it or should do it, and we should find ways to help that. But if we are confused about the mission, we're not going to be able to move forward. So we set about an agenda that was very, very clear, and we had 3 pieces of our theory of action. We were going to transform human capital, that is how we hire, fire, train, retain, promote, compensate, and place teachers, staff, principals. The second was that we were going to run the organization in a pretty clear and compelling way as a business, because I take money off of people's kitchen table every single day in the form of tax dollars, most of which they cannot afford to give us, and we transpose 89% of that into salary and benefits. And the quid pro quo for that is students graduate. And so, at an $8 billion annual organization, plus $7 billion on top of that in construction, we set a couple of metrics, 15 to be clear, and we manage in a very strong performance management. And a bunch of those metrics were things that related to what we talked about today, and you'll talk about tomorrow. And I'll narrow that for the scope of this conversation. Who's safe in schools, who's staying in schools, who's being kicked out of schools, how parents feel included in schools, how students feel safe in schools, et cetera. And then the last one was high-quality public choice. We believe that students and parents have the right to choice. We have 9 different types of schools of the 1,019 campuses. And we also have the largest number of charter schools in America. I have authorized more charters and closed more charters in my period of time. So we had about 88 1,000 students in charters when I began, and 5 years later, there's 131,000 students in charters, and we have the highest performing portfolio in the country. That was our theory of action, and we kind of went at that piece. And he said, like, so why does it matter in LA? So it matters in LA because the economic viability of the state of California is intrinsically linked with how well LA does, and how well LA does is compared to the workforce, which we give the overwhelming contribution. And the viability of this country is absolutely dependent upon how well California does. Nothing grandiose, but it's real. I mean, I say LA is America only sooner, and we are definitely coming to a hometown near you. Who we look like, what we're successful with, what we struggle with. So it matters enormously. So that's the context of where I get the privilege of working. Let me give you a little bit of the context of this topic. America does not have the tallest building in the world anymore. And we do not have the tallest Ferris wheel in the world anymore. And we don't have the largest shopping mall in the world anymore. But we are absolutely number one at one thing, and that is the population we incarcerate. We win that hands down. We incarcerate more people than any other country. 1 in 108 Americans, that's 2.2 million of us, are behind bars in the US. We are the largest prison population on the planet. I don't know why that's the case, but it vastly outstrips any other democracy. And I think we better square up really quickly why we are putting people behind bars, who we are putting behind bars, and how long we are leaving them behind bars. We know that the prison system in this country is profoundly disproportionate. It's disproportionately black and it's disproportionately Latino. It is disproportionately students out of public schools who struggle. They don't arrive in prison as adults. They get adjudicated and incarcerated, and I will argue deliberately, as young people. There is, in my opinion, a piece of this that is willful, a piece of this that is not accidental. And I want to take us, if you don't mind, through a little bit of a story around understanding context and what we can do about that. We are certainly the land of the free and the home of the brave, but we are also the land that gives life without parole to children. We actually claim horrific violations of human rights to other countries for things that I see in my own backyard. If you did not read The New Yorker that just came out, the story by Jennifer Garneman, and I hope I pronounced that journalist's names correctly, about Caliph Broder, I would compel you to read that story. Only because it is not an outlier. We could take a train and a small car ride to Rikers, and you can understand what happened to Caliph. This is a young man who was accused of stealing a backpack, if you haven't read the story, and the system took 3 years of his life and kept him behind bars there. He was never adjudicated, he was never tried. Eventually, there was no charges eventually finally pressed against him, and then he was let go around that. As I said before, this is dead serious for me. We have a system in Los Angeles of juvenile prisons which are called camps. It's a bizarre term, I know, if you're not from California. There's nothing camp-like about it. They're youth prisons around that. And I've come to truly believe in my soul that one of the great oxymorons in this country is the notion of juvenile justice. I think it is neither about justice and it is about children. So I would really urge us never to use this word juvenile again. It makes no sense around that. Go to any major city. You can go to Cook County Prison in Chicago. You can go to Rikers here you can go to Central Processing in Dallas, or you can come to any of the many, many camps in LA. And I would like you to see what you cannot see on a regular day when you visit the cities, but only these camps. Thousands and thousands of children who are incarcerated, who are criminalized at an early age. Usually, from practices, policies, and procedures that emanate from school systems. And that's what I want to talk about in the remaining time I have around this. How I think this has stemmed from this notion of zero tolerance in this country, which I think has completely translated into zero common sense. And the opportunities that we have before us about doing something around that. So when I'm most sobered and sad, I will tell you that there are clinics in Beverly Hills that treat dogs better than the conditions that you would find youth in prisons in this country. They are fed better, they are treated better when they have to be taken care of for a week while their families travel. Solutions to needless criminalization are not intractable. The solutions to this work are not insolvable. This is not cold fusion. This is a way, in my opinion, about gaining some center of balance around common sense and public acts of professional courage for the other. And the other are the people who want to be us. We will need to develop a facility and a skill set around language to deal with race and class to do that. And that is also possible. Deeply uncomfortable, but possible. So in LA, what we did was a series of 3 buckets of work while we tried to bring to the forefront the issue of race and class and who was being criminalized and what we should do about that. And that had to do with suspension, and it had to do with a student climate bill of rights and a city coming together to change student rights. And it also had to do with this element of criminalization or citing young people for criminal offenses, which we talked about. And there are results that I find I'm incredibly proud of. I would argue, as a mathematician in the background, they would be astonishing, but they are not enough, and we should not, and I am not satisfied. I am very pleased, but not satisfied, because we have more to do. So let me tell you about each one of these pieces of work that we attempted. When I first got to LA, I was told that we had this huge dropout problem. And so visited schools, and you know, obviously we tend to have our proclivity, a high school guy, you know, bring me a cafeteria on the edge of riot any given day, and I am like my son, great at that kind of stuff. Kindergarten classroom, I break out in a cold sweat. I mean, you know, if you go to a kindergarten classroom, they just come right at you and grab onto your legs. I'm like, whoa, we don't touch. Everybody to the letter square, please, step off. But high schools are where I was told we had these massive problems, and I just wasn't finding it. I just did not see hundreds of kids being and dropping out and finding jobs in Los Angeles. It just wasn't the case. Nor did I actually see schools that were violent or in chaos. What I actually saw was profound boredom and kind of like students being anesthetized, would the way I would describe it. So I'm trying to understand, where were they going? And we began by, one of the data points was suspension. So I know we're big, so just do the math in the back of your head for a second. So when I began, we had 48,000 individual suspensions a year. That's 48,000 suspensions a year. I said, let's understand this, and we broke them down. And they were overwhelmingly disproportionately youth who were black and youth who were males and youth who were Latino. Now, in LA, you are 9 times more likely to be suspended if you're a black young man, and that is 1/9 of the population. So it doesn't even square around that. So they had a disproportionality. And so I said, oh my God, these must be just horrendous situations. So let's take every single solitary suspension and read them. And we pulled them apart. And what I learned was a fraction were for what we call the big 5. You know, you brought drugs to school and sold them or used them. There's going to be a very serious consequence for that. You brought a weapon to school. There's a very serious consequence for that. You struck another individual. There's a very serious consequence for that. They were a tiny fraction of those. What we realized was overwhelmingly these suspensions fell into a single category called willful defiance. Willful defiance. So I said, okay, that means we must have kids standing on desks with a baseball bat saying, I'm going to take you out to the teacher. Wasn't seeing it. Could not understand this. So we read every willful defiant and realized that they were things like repeated failure to bring notebook to class, would not pick up papers off the floor, was unprepared for class, would not take seat on time. And these students would be suspended over and over and over again. Bottom line is we didn't have a dropout problem whatsoever. We had a push-out problem. We were pushing youth out of school. So first policy change was we came to the board and said we want to change. We will remove willful defiance as a reason to suspend students. If you are about to do something that is heinous in the classroom, that's not willful defiance. That is a threat to bodily harm. It's a big difference between not having a notebook for 5 days and saying I'm going to hit you. Let's separate the difference here right away. And then, of course, the policy change wasn't enough. You have to track it every single month by every single school and talk to every single principal about what's happening. 4 years later, we had less than 8,000 suspensions last year. So we went from 48,000 to 8,000. That's a good start. That is a good start around that work. And no surprise, student achievement went up, particularly young black male achievement went up dramatically, and graduation rates have moved. When I started at 58%, and last year we just posted 77%, which is a big change. I would love to say, that is, what Deasy and his team pulled that one off. We did some of that. What we fundamentally said was, just stay with us. If we don't throw you away, you will actually do well, and you will graduate. The second thing was that we actually needed a climate in school that believed in students and believed that when you make mistakes, we can help correct those mistakes. Community organizations came forward and constructed the Student Bill of Rights. And we pushed this through. And this began the things like re-entry centers, where we funded re-entry centers around the city. We will get to a day when it will not be necessary to have a re-entry center, but we're not there yet. This is where students coming out of prison can't go right into the high school and say, re-enroll me, because we're finding out that's not working. You have to go to a place that's one-stop shopping, enrolls you, gets you on track, gives you a schedule, then sends you to John Jay High School, so that the guidance counselor or whatever that school can't say, no, not here, you're overage, under credit. Doesn't work that way. Reentry center is very powerful. And I am convinced that I get your world. Trust me. You give me both heart attack and help all in the same time as journalists. I get your world. You are constantly feeding 10, if not more, stories. If people could understand context in a way that matters to them, you will do justice in the fourth estate to having people understand that this is something that need not be and can be fundamentally different. And I will, as I have, stood up and say, I want to own our piece in public education and do something about that. I thank you for what you do. It is not easy. You get a lot of crap. But I also understand that it's astounding to me how many parents look to you for answers. You own a chunk of trust that most institutions don't own. Use that capital very carefully. And in this particular space, help understand that I'm going to get old and so are you. And someone's going to put a needle in my arm, and I want them knowing what they're doing. Someone is going to change the tires on the plane when I leave LAX to visit my grandchildren. I actually want them knowing what they're doing. Someone's going to switch the lights on the red line in LA. I want them knowing what they're doing. Every one of those people are going to be a graduate of LAUSD. I need them to be successful. So do we in the cities, and we're not going to get there if our policy is to criminalize and incarcerate first, as opposed to build. There is a giant difference in my mind when people want to say that these behaviors are, delinquent. No, they're not. They're adolescent. Okay, not refusing to bring your notebook to class is adolescent behavior. It is not delinquent behavior. And you can help us in that case. So those are the comments I wanted to share, and I really thank you for giving me the opportunity to share those and talk a little bit about the work that we're doing in LA. I'm proud of it. It's not finished by any means. I don't want any more Caleb's. I think that story is arresting beyond belief. And it's in every city in this country. So if you want to do Q&A, that's great. I also said that I didn't want to do this after you had eaten because it's a very serious picture of America, but I'd be glad to if you want to.
So, thank you very much.
Thanks.
So, questions? Yes, ma'am.
First, a comment and then a question.
Yeah.
First, thank you for saying over and over again in your talk that these problems are not insurmountable. I think one challenge that journalists face is that oftentimes readers.
Oh, I think they're recording this, ma'am, so I think they want you to say it into the microphone.
Yeah, I'll stand here.
You can start with that compliment again. If
Okay. No, I was thanking him for saying over and over again how these problems are not insurmountable, because a challenge that we face as journalists is that readers or listeners or viewers are hearing stories that sound impossible to solve, which really turns them off. Certainly, I can speak from a newspaper perspective, that when they pick up these stories and it's so complicated and so it just sounds like there's no way it's ever gonna be solved, they really kind of turn off. They don't even necessarily want to read that story. So I think that's really an important message to get across, that these are things that can be solved. Mm-hmm. It's not impossible. So my question is, how did principals and teachers react to efforts to lower suspensions? Because I can imagine that a number of them felt you were taking away a stick, mm-hmm. and that they, either were opposed to it or concerned about it. And related to that, what were the alternatives to suspensions, and how did you promote and enforce student accountability?
Yeah, so the reactions were mixed, but not verbal. So I think that's an important piece. So it's very difficult to organize a rally. First of all, you can organize a rally against me on any given day, but it's very difficult to organize a rally and say, we're for incarceration. So fundamentally, what you get is silence and consent, but you then get uneven enforcement. And that, I think, is where the work takes place. And shame and blame don't get us to an improved situation. So you have to provide resources, and we did. I mean, we put huge increases in counselors who were just about dealing with restorative justice, a huge increase with counselors who were only dealing with students in the foster care system. We chose to do a student-weighted funding formula, so schools that historically had the least now get the most. So yes, we put resources in, bounded by policy and guidelines, with expectations. So the accountability report card is very balanced. So we want what we would call the affective domain to how schools look, how parents are perceiving them, how students perceive them. And we also want to understand your suspension rates, and we want to understand your achievement rates, and we want to understand your graduation rates. And by and large, I think when people begin to feel just even a little bit of success, and we celebrate that, that was very contagious as opposed to a whole lot of shame. What was really instrumental was that we built bridges with the LAPD and LAUSD PD. So we have a sworn officer, we have our own police system. It's the sixth largest in the country. And LAPD, of course, is their own, like NYPD. And that was very important before we moved forward on this. And that has gone quite well. And recognizing the community-based organizations that lift up these policies. And of course, it's hard. It's like, how dare you, and so forth and so on. As opposed to saying, the tactic we tried to take was, you're right, help us. Let's be a partner about this, as opposed to let's go into camps and say, you're criticizing us and it's hostile. And No, what's hostile is the condition the youth is living in. That's hostile. So let's do something about that together. And then they doubled down on the support they gave. And of course, that support's all free. You don't get hired as a principal in LA unless you kind of believe and are willing to do that part. So I want to say that that's honest. We've had more than half the principals change. We hire people who believe in the mission. Did I answer your question?
Did you mention what the alternative is?
Oh, I'm sorry. So, so we have youth court, which is a whole big piece of the work where students for certain offenses actually create the sets of consequences done with our colleagues in the actual judicial system. We have the whole restorative justice piece, which is having people understand their impact for disrespectful and concerning behavior on others in schools, and having students understand how that feels and accepting a consequence public for that. Traditional sets of consequences. What we're trying to do is at all costs, if you need to be removed from a classroom, it doesn't mean you have to be removed from the school. If you have to be removed from the school, it doesn't mean I have to say goodbye to you, so that there are centers where you go to. Truants don't go to the police station. They come back to school in reentry centers. All of those types of things were put into place.
I'm
Hi.
curious if you could speak to school policing. Obviously, there's a safety component of making sure
Yep.
the environment is safe for learning, but at the same time, we've heard a lot of comments today about SROs and how they kind of tie into the zero tolerance policies and how a lot of parents fear their child being caught with a little bit of drugs in their locker, for example. So, but on the other hand, I can see an opportunity for SROs being building bridges with communities that may historically not trust them
Yep.
and could be role models. So what have you done in
Yeah.
LA?
I wanted to say that those women and men have been extraordinary because I think that they were side by side with us. Their training about being part of restorative justice was huge. Their desire to be mentors and role models, we capitalized upon. The notion that they fundamentally, their job is not to do what a principal or an assistant principal once did and should be doing around that. And then setting out very clear, there are consequences to behaviors. So you shouldn't have tobacco products. And we know it's just you shouldn't have them. You shouldn't have alcohol. But that doesn't mean that that is your first offense. You actually have to go to central processing downtown in LA. There are consequences for that. I mean, we're a state where marijuana is, you could have your own institute about where we are with that whole thing. But that is, so there are laws around, decriminalization, there are laws around that. It's still inappropriate at your age, if you're, a minor in the laws, to have that. But that is not the same as selling meth. There's an entire world difference around that we have tried to parse out. Those were not the difficult pieces. It was the scuffles on campus. It is the interaction that is dishonorable and volatile between adult and child. That's where we've had to tell police, you need to help step aside. Adults were trained to deal with this. I was a principal. You have to understand what de-escalation means, and you have to be able to be skilled at that. So instead of get out of my classroom because you're yelling, it's like, it's not going so good right now. You got 2 minutes. Why don't you sit? We'll return to the conversation. Clearly you're having a bad morning. I don't know what it's about. I want you to do well. Take 2 minutes. 2 years ago, it's like ticket. And the police don't belong involved in that one, around that. Now, you strike of someone, that's a problem. Fights are rare. They're not common. They're just not common. And then the other thing I just want to put on the table, I don't know about most of your world, but this is absolutely a part of my world. You have thousands of students who live in mortal fear of being found because they are not documented. And this is an overriding fear. I mean, LA is just, we are the center of non-documented. And we're just not going to give the government an opportunity to intervene on that. That is both our belief and our policies. And so that is, we've had to work on that one as well.
Can you talk a little bit more about how you got buy-in from both school police, the LAUSD school chief is a former LAPD officer,
Yeah.
and the LAPD to go along with this?
Yeah, so first thing I would say about our chief, who is Chief Zipperman, never worked with anybody like him in my life. Very much a leader in wanting this to happen, and very much, I guess I would use just an honorable human being about knowing. I mean, there are a few jobs I'll never have. One is being in the police, and one is having to lead police, and it's a culture that's so hard. I get that. And so when we talk about public acts of professional courage, basically saying we're going to move towards decriminalization, when fundamentally the DNA is you're not there to do that, you're to do something else, required, I think, a set of leadership that was quite strong. And it was fortuitous. I can't say that it wasn't remarkably fortuitous that he came from LAPD. So he owned those bridges for us, and we have a phenomenal chief there in Charlie Beck. So good relationships that we built upon, and when it goes south, which it does, I mean, it's a gigantic animal. We're bigger than 7 states. When it goes south, you do a postmortem. You call people together. Okay, like, how did this one get out of control? How did we not do a good job on this one? And when you have that relationship, you can figure that one out and say, okay, good lesson learned. Let's correct it and move forward so it doesn't happen again.
So both of them got it, essentially.
Both of them got it. I want to say they didn't need to be convinced. A lot of work on professional development for the rank and file to get it. Buy-in, hey, so not everybody's bought in yet. Let me just be really clear about that. They're loving the results. They're not necessarily thrilled about the means. And that's because I think we're no different than the rest of the country. We were sold a bill of goods some 2 decades ago that all seemed about safety and the American way. And what it was a rapid escalation towards taking whole chunks of the population that were difficult to work with and getting them out. And what we're saying is we're not going to operate that way anymore. And I have to do that not on kind of the moral platform. I can't give that king's speech every single day. But it is asking people to square up with a sense of dissidence. And that takes a lot of time.
Thank you, sir. I come from Baltimore, and we actually just came off a 4 or 5 year span where we implemented almost everything that we talked about, and everything negative went down, everything positive went up. But I'm just curious to see what you think are your next steps to keep everything moving in the right direction.
Hanging on to my job. And that is for real. So I think it is like Baltimore, which I know very, very well. And, you know, hell of a run with the sports team at the moment, but not over yet. But I think what was interesting was part of the work was to drive it into the drinking water all the time. Community owned it. The faith-based organizations owned it. The community-based organizations owned it. The police owned it. Mayor, it was a she at the time that I was there, owned it. The schools owned this issue, so that when there's change, it doesn't just snap back because it was a one-man, one-woman initiative. It has to be of and part of a community. So that's one piece. For us, which I have to say, I don't think I would have thought of this 10 years ago in my life. The role that judges can play in a remarkably different context was incredibly helpful. So in my backyard, we have a judge by the name of Nash, who I can't say enough about. Now, I don't want to be in front of him, and no youth wants to be in front of him. But saying that his entire purpose is because I don't want you in front of me, and helping the system not get you in front of me, was really unbelievable. So the role for, I think, the courts in the form of judges has been helpful. Hi.
Hi. Hi. One of the panelists earlier today was making some connections between the kind of increasingly high-stakes academic environment nationally, with education reform and closing schools and standardized tests, and between that and school discipline and, educators kind of being under-resourced and increasingly pressured. And I was wondering if you have observations about that as a superintendent of a huge school district.
I do. how much time do you have? I mean, that's a gigantic animal. So I'll try to use 50,000-foot pieces right away. So we definitely lost our way in this country around kind of high-stakes accountability. So there's a balance that matters, and we're trying to swing more towards a center. So it does matter. I mean, we have some deliverables. So the fact that students should know something and demonstrate they know it, that they didn't know before this, and can graduate, that's our business. So I don't think the board over here at St. Luke's Roosevelt is sitting there tonight saying, well, they can judge us on anything, but mortality rates, that's off the table. They cannot hold us accountable for that. Okay, you go to the hospital to live. And so mortality rates actually matter around that. You know, they're not judging the train system here on you can do anything but crash rates. That's off the table. You actually take the subway to get to the other place without being in a crash. When you come to school to graduate, and so those do matter, and they should have stake. It is the fact that that's not the only thing that matters around that. So do I think it has had some impact on this? I do. I want to say that there are two things about this. The incarceration in California is no different than the under-resourcing of teachers. These are deliberate decisions. These are not just an act of nature. They're not part of the Constitution of the United States. It's a choice to build prisons, to make them a center of enterprise so that when you have less prisoners, you actually have people losing their jobs. And so therefore, when you do a 3-strike rule, I mean, this is a choice. And it is a choice where and who ends up in prison looks like. These aren't like an accident. And the resourcing of teachers is not some federal, found in the Constitution. It's a choice. We could choose to fund preschool and defund prison. We choose not to do that. So what I'm saying is, long story short, there is definitely an affect around that and a connection. It need not be.
Hi. Thanks for coming. Yeah. So a lot of the things that were touched on today deal with inherent biases, and a little bit of background and how they inform almost every problem that we've talked about today. And I grew up in the South, and there are people that I know and love who I believe are good people at heart, but I've spent my entire life telling them that they're wrong and that the prejudice that they hold are part of the problem, and they never want to hear me, right? Okay, and I hope that this isn't too burdensome or an inappropriate question, but I'm asking with a fair amount of desperation as a journalist and as a human being, how do you make people care? How do you inform them about these things without pushing them away and alienating them?
I mean, I think if I could contribute to that answer, I would have like a very different career trajectory. I don't know how you do make people care, but I think there is something inherent in the human being to have kind of fundamental regard for young people. I think that's just part of us. I don't know how else to describe that. I actually think it's a genetic predisposition. We take the most difficult human being and stick an infant in front of them, and there's a change. So we know that. Like when we have a very tough situation, we bring people together, and we're sitting at a table, and the first thing is, oh, look at this data. So, well, I'm not a racist. I want to be really clear about that right at the beginning. And I'm like, okay. The fact that that has to be said as the precursor might be a signal that this is a topic we need to get a better sense of language around, because no one should be judging that, but why does that have to be the context for which we then have to declare that all my other comments come from someplace other than I might have bias? So I think that it is an unbelievable struggle in this country, and I think schools are a bit of a crucible for this struggle, that we still flounder around class and race, and we flounder around kind of bias, and we flounder around assumption. And sticking giant posters up and just talking about it doesn't help. I mean, I toyed for a long time about, like, I wanted to give this talk, and I wanted these two big posters, and I use this, and they're 2 hoodies with just no face in them. And they're the exact same hoodie. And when I post it, and I talk about this, and then I flash the name, and it's Trayvon Martin, and then it's Zuckerberg. Exact same hoodie. Like, what's that all about? And I think the suspending judgment for human growth, I think, is kind of how I think about that. Unless you act out on the bias and the racism, and then I think that has to be called out.
So we don't want to take it.
Yeah, I'm just going to, like, maybe 5 more minutes, and I'll talk less, and I'll try to go rapid. Go ahead.
Okay. Sure. I love everything you said so far. You're the man. I just
So
want to
far.
say that. You're the man.
Yeah, right.
You mentioned undocumented students, and I would like you to just speak a little bit to the fears that you were talking about in them, and also what happens when, for example, their undocumented parents are actually deported. What situation is that?
Is a gigantic issue. So the fear is I'll be found. We probably had more deportations last summer in LAUSD than we had any other summer before that. So I don't want to go through this speech. I'll save that for a different time. I mean, say that we have a broken policy in this country around immigration reform, broken. So that being the case, I also know my own politic. I am, in case you didn't pick this one up, I'll declare I'm decidedly left of center in my belief system, and I work in places where I can be free to lead around that piece. That being said, the fear of having to declare comes in so many ways. You can't get a library card, you can't get a license, you can't get a TV cable in your home. Everything, you forget your doctor and your dentist or anything that would require an address, a social security number is just a dead end. And the biggest fear is actually being in trouble with authority, and authority is the police. And because the very first set of questions they ask you go back to the declarations, and for right or wrong, a solution is to say goodbye rather than having to remediate. And that's a different form of bias that we're just not able to give language to already in this country. And it's one that I'm incredibly worried about for students. So what we try to do is we put kind of an iron curtain around stuff. Like, you can't ask for a social security number. You can't, anything like that, you're just forbidden to ask for when you come into school. And that's just kind of the framework for which we have to do this. But it has a perverse other effect. When you yourself are a victim and you should be speaking up, you don't. So therefore, both a perpetrator who would be doing something inappropriate to another person isn't being corrected, and you are not declaring. And that's just a piece that we haven't gotten our hands around yet. I don't have a solution to it. But it is disgusting and heartbreaking. I mean, we opened, because we had so many people come this summer, where we do everything for you. I mean, you have your physical exam, you have your psychiatrist, you have your assessment, we give you a schedule, we enroll you in school, we tell you how to get food and shelter and all this kind of stuff. It's one-stop shopping to get you into school around this. And then the stories that kids will tell you is just, it's mind-boggling. It is mind-boggling. And I kid you not, in the next 2 weeks, this whole unraveling about the mass graves, that didn't happen by accident. There are kids in our school system who one of their brothers has been found at this point. So it's very tough. It's very tough, and it's all intertwined in this. I'll say it in a less generous way. It is much easier to deport a kid than it is to actually adjudicate a kid. Yeah.
Okay.
Hi.
Hi.
Hometown newspaper.
Yes, hometown. So if I could ask a hometown question, what do you think should be done with the juvenile camps and halls in LA County? And do you have any thoughts on?
Yeah, I do.
kind
I
of
think the school system should take over the educational component of it. And I think that we should think really differently. I want to set aside felonious behavior. Can I just put that into one side? Because I don't think we're equipped to deal with that.
Yeah, and actually, I had a second part to that
Okay.
question.
Non-felonious repetitive behavior, I think that we should begin to share the responsibility for that, if not actually direct some of that.
Okay. And what do you think of LA County Probation's move towards trying to implement the small group model in some of the camps?
Yeah, I mean, it's so promising. I wonder if I don't know if the culture there will embrace that. But if we did it as partners, I think there's a huge chance for success. And those can't, I mean, 80% of them are youth anyway, so we could figure out some centers to pull this out. I mean, I think, without getting too political, I think Gloria Molina has really thought a lot about how to press this for good. I'm a little, quite frankly, and I don't vote for her, but I am worried, she's termed out, like, well, who's going to pick up the mantle after that? So continuing it and senses of proof points are the two things I would love to see. Hi.
I'm wondering what happened to the boredom you saw in the schools when you went through and you were touring the high schools and everything, if that's been fixed or if that still exists.
It's not fixed. It's gotten better, but it's gotten better through, like, a lot of stress. Adult stress. So, in case you're a reporter who doesn't know anything in this room, which I find hard to believe, the teachers union is not throwing me a big party this month in LA. Maybe next month. I hope next month, but not this month. And a lot of people had a lot of adult discomfort when we said that we were going to take the cap off and teachers had unlimited opportunities to what we'd have pilot schools, which you can write your own contract. You don't follow the teacher's contract. So we went from 10 to 90, where teachers opened up schools and wrote their own contracts, which means they had an elected work agreement. You only work 1 year at a time. Where we closed schools and gave them to charters if they were the best provider, public school choice. So there were pieces where results were good and stress was high. I do come at this, and I say this, and I'm not going to back away from this. I get that adults can be unhappy around this stuff, and I get that this can be really difficult. But if we want discomfort, you got to go to Huntington Park High School, and we can talk to families who live in cars behind the high school. If we want discomfort, help you meet the young ladies. We have schools just for young ladies who are pregnant or just had their babies, and their significant others if they want to go to school there too. There are kids who haven't seen an OBGYN except for the day they had their kid. In the United States of America, 2014, that's discomfort. I am sure the adults can figure this one out. But a lot of redesign, repurposing, reopening of schools change that, but it's by no means everywhere yet. So I'm going to thank folks for questions. I am going to try to transition as rapidly as humanly possible at this point so that I could get to the plane, go back to my land.